everybody. Welcome. Happy Friday. Welcome to Sci-Fi. Great episode for you today. A few quick things before we get started. Eliot, you do look, I can't not say, you do look exactly like British football commentator John Motson sat in the media part of a football stadium.
Right. Oh, the last time you said that, I thought you meant like Dr. Watson and you were Holmes.
No,
but no, I still don't know who the football manager is, despite my jersey and my old-fashioned.
But have you? What is that? You just married into Newcastle United, have you?
Yeah, that's the case. And then the Saudis bought them, and now we're really good, and no one seems to care that the Saudis bought them.
You came along with the Saudi money.
I feel like I went to Newcastle, and the Saudis, also were like, oh, well, if Eliot's there, we should be there.
Yeah.
And they came along. I assume that's how things work because I don't understand that there are things outside my perceptions.
And that's why you're the right host for this podcast. Right, just very quickly before we'll get straight onto it, but just very quickly before, I just want to say really a big thanks to our patrons, and especially welcome to new patrons that we've got, which we actually are getting, which is great. Really happy to see you guys there. Eliot and I are doing these kind of classes about psychoanalytic texts. So we've done Freud's Criminals from a Sense of Guilt and Lacan's Mirror Stage. We're going to do another text this week. We haven't quite decided, but we also want recommendations from our patrons about what texts we should read and discuss in the Patreon B-side. So, but big thanks to all of you for supporting us. The link is in the description below. I'm really happy today to be joined by Russell Sbriglia, who is a lecturer, professor, as they call it over there, in English literature, which is going to be interesting for me, especially as I came from a literary background and then kind of went towards psychoanalysis. And Russell similarly has done so. And he's at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. And he's done several books, including one with Slavoj Žižek about Hegel and Lacan and materialism, and he's working on a monograph at the moment about Melville and Lacan. So we're going to talk a bit about 19th century literature and psychoanalysis. But great to have you on, Russell, and thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks. So it's an honor to be here. So thanks for having me. Great.
Yeah. No. I mean, maybe this place to start is with the general relationship between psychoanalysis and literature. Because obviously we get this comes up, and I think I guess my feeling here is that for a certain time, I don't know what it's like in the US. Perhaps you'll put me right on this, but in the UK, psychoanalysis kind of at a certain point was connected with psychology, and then it got kind of rejected out by the psychology disciplines, and it kind of kept itself alive by sort of attaching itself to literature departments and film departments, and kind of existed alongside literature and film. And obviously I think there's all sorts of issues with this as well, but I just wonder if we could start with what is this weird relationship between literature and psychoanalysis. I mean, your work generally speaking is about both of these things. How do you kind of see them as being connected or working together, and what do you think is the way to approach this question of, do literature and psychoanalysis belong together, should we say?
Yeah, well, I think I think what you described is pretty much accurate on the American scene as well. Except psychoanalysis has kind of, in literary studies has attenuated a bit. Its real heyday was in, the mid to late 70s, early 80s with the big theory turn in literature departments. And so Lacan was influential then, but it was a Lacan that, most of us, working in psychoanalytic theory today, not that we wouldn't recognize, but it's this older Lacan of the imaginary and the symbolic, as opposed to, once people like Slavoj Žižek and Joan Kupchak came around and started focusing more on the later Lacan and symbolic and real, that shifted things. So, if you go back and look at, I'd say like 90% of psychoanalytically inflected literary criticism, from the 70s, 80s, it's really part of the linguistic turn. So it's Lacan as a philosopher of language, more or less. And actually it's Lacan as post-structuralist, kind of just lumped in with everyone else in that same milieu, Derrida and everything. And it really, isn't until we were saying Žižek and Kupchak that gets disarticulated from that. But I think now it kind of survives in the academy through, things like film studies and media studies. Not that people in literature don't do it, but for instance, in my own field of 19th century American literature, there are some people who work in psychoanalysis, but specifically like a Lacanian theoretical orientation, there are very few of us. So I think it's kind of similar to what you described. As far as like the relation between literature and psychoanalysis is concerned, Alfie, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I came to psychoanalysis very late in my graduate work, and that kind of my interest in it kind of sustained me through a terrible job market and everything, because that was the one thing that I was interested in, or that that was pulling me in that direction to keep me going. I like to think literature is so inextricably linked to psychoanalysis. I mean, the Oedipus complex is the most obvious example, right? I mean, right there from Freud's most foundational theory, along with obviously the unconscious, but that he takes this from literature, or he gets this from seeing a dramatization of Oedipus. And my approach to it, and I hope that comes through in my work, is that rather than using psychoanalysis as a kind of heuristic that you import onto the literature, or a sort of machine that you just put the literature in and it churns out this psychoanalytic reading, I'm interested in the authors that I write about, like Melville, Edgar Allan Poe. I'm big into the mid 19th century, that they're doing a kind of psychoanalysis avant la lettre, so that literature is doing the kind of work of theory, as opposed to, okay, let's take the theory and see how it works with the literature. So yeah, I'm interested in how people like Melville and Poe articulated these, a psychoanalytic, sort of proto-psychoanalytic notion of subjectivity before Freud and obviously before Lacan entered the scene.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good answer, really important. I mean, I hope I'm getting this right, but one of the problems in the way in which psychoanalysis and literature plug into each other is exactly as you say, this idea that the literature is a text to be decoded or whatever, and psychoanalysis is a tool or a key which we use to sort of unlock the true status of the text, or the hidden status of the text. And this is a kind of nonsense that lived for many decades in literary studies, right? Yeah. But actually what you're saying is more interesting than that like the process of writing, is akin to the process of psychoanalysis, in the sense that, it's not about saying, but the text kind of, the words of the text play out something psychoanalytic, right, in the subject. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so for instance, something I'm working on now on Poe and the Santome, I'm looking at. Poe's, it's his most famous, everyone will have been familiar with this, even if they're not familiar with a lot of Poe, his poem, The Raven. And The Raven, quoth the Raven, nevermore. And if you read Poe's essay on how he allegedly wrote The Raven, it's pretty unbelievable. You'll probably leave it pretty incredulous. But he does say that the reason why, and this happens all the time whenever I teach it. It's like the students want to say, well, the speaker has gone crazy and he's hallucinating. And Poe is very careful to say, no, actually everything is within the bounds of the real. He doesn't mean the Lacanian real, but everything that happens in the poem is real. But the reason why the speaker keeps asking these sort of increasingly, and I do mean this in the psychoanalytic sense, hysterical questions of the Raven, when he knows, I mean, Poe says he knows very well that that nevermore is just, it's nonsensical, right? The Raven doesn't know what it means. It's just repeating something that it learned. But, the speaker keeps asking him because Poe says he's indulging in, the human thirst for self-torture and because it's the most delicious, because the most intolerable of sorrow. And so that's a good example for me where like nevermore is functioning perfectly as this Santome, as a symptom that's just sort of penetrated with enjoyment. But I don't think you necessarily need Lacan to make that point, or that you have to import it into there. It's doing the work of theorizing that, even though it's not obvious. It's 100 years before Lacan. So that would be an example of how I think it's not so much. I mean, you could view it as, well, you're just applying Lacanian theory to it, but it's far more interesting to me to think about the ways in which the literature itself is already articulating different sort of psychoanalytic concepts, or a constellation of concepts, in a way that it's not until we come to Freud or Lacan that we have a language for this.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's quite clear, and I think in a sense the Raven's a good example there, because it's not the hidden meaning or the meaning of the speech that matters, but the speech itself, right? And this is a broadly psychoanalytic kind of approach. I think that's good. Yeah. And I guess I wanted to, while you were on the subject of Melville, I was actually thinking of maybe even reading the quote from your article that's from Moby Dick, because I think one of the things that seems clear to me is that one of the things that unites your approaches in your essay on enjoyment as an ontological factor, and in the chapter on Melville, is this idea of what moves us, right? And you talked about it just now through Drive, the character from, what's the novel called? The Coquette, right?
Yes.
Where you talk about how she's driven through drive. And then in this quotation I'm about to read from Moby Dick, it's about what propels us, right? And I think this is a massively psychoanalytic question, right? In what way do we act under orders, right? And this is obviously in a broad sense what psychoanalysis can do, right? It can allow us to kind of question impulses, affects, and it's instead why am I enjoying, and what kind of enjoyment is going through me, right? What is moving me? What is pushing me in X or Y direction? And what am I experiencing as I do that? So I think like you're broadly seem to be using literature to kind of think through this problem, right? And so I suppose I'm going to read the quote in a sec, but is it also that literature moves the subject in precisely this way? That literature turns you into an ideological subject in the process of reading, and moves you, starts to kind of drive you?
Well, I mean, that's what's actually, if you go. So, for instance, you mentioned this novel, The Coquette. So I have a piece that's on riffing on Zizek, enjoyment as an ontological factor. And it's the first. Is it the first? It's one of the first novels published in America. But in the late 18th and early 19th century, these novels were commonly read as, and they were mostly written to be didactic, to serve some sort of educationary function, or pedagogical function for the reader. And if you go back and look at essays written in the late 18th, early 19th century, there was great anxiety about literature's ability, similar, I mean, not all that different from the panic, I don't know, 20 something years ago now, when video games first started taking off, that it's going to, violent video games are going to beget violence. So that there was this worry that if readers identify too much with the character, that they're going to be steered away or driven away in the way that the characters are. So The Coquette is a seduction novel about a young woman who is seduced by a rake libertine, and typical for the genre, she gets pregnant. The rake seducer leaves her, and she dies shortly after childbirth. So there was almost always this the moral at the end, like the woman, it's usually a woman who transgresses has to be punished, so that readers don't take her example, or don't follow her example. But there are all kinds of essays and book reviews worried about the power of literature to drive us, whether it's identification with the character, or just the power of sort of the lore of narrative itself. And so, it'd be interesting to go back. I can't think of any specific ones off the top of my head, but many pieces exhibiting a sort of great anxiety about again, the power of literature to sort of unlock this this unconscious enjoyment.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a great example as well of how this isn't about using psychoanalysis as a sort of intellectual tool to help us understand things, but about how things move us and why they do.
Enjoyment is traumatic, right? I think that's the message, really. This is enjoyment, but there is no painting over the trauma of enjoyment, no matter how much we meditate.
Exactly. And so I'm interested in, maybe we'll talk about this in a minute with Moby Dick, but I'm interested in characters. That character from The Coquette, Eliza Warden says this specifically. Characters in Poe, who they very specifically talk about being split. Like the heroine of The Coquette says, I know what the right thing to do is, but I'm paraphrasing here, but she does use the term evil genius. She says, I feel like an evil genius presides over all my actions. And that, I think, is kind of, the split where I almost read evil genius there as the emergence of this kind of monstrous subjectivity against the ego or the I. That's another problem that you get in not just literary studies, but a sort of I don't want to go too far afield here, but the psychoanalytic understanding or definition of the subject often gets conflated with the phenomenological sort of observer or the I. So there's a lot of differentiation that has to take place there. But Eliot, to your point, it's always this sort of traumatic enjoyment that that these characters feel compelled or feel even like a moral obligation, right, to enjoy beyond the pleasure principle.
Right. I mean, one of the things that that really sticks out to me is that it's kind of like, rather than the Deleuzian multiplicity of desire, you get like the multiplicity of trauma with literature. In psychoanalysis, I think it makes sense that psychoanalysis and literature kind of go together in kind of a sequence. Psychoanalysis, I feel like, is very much kind of centered after the fact of a thing. And literature is kind of posits itself as the thing, right? So it makes sense that these don't really step over each other.
Yeah,
right?
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I think the other thing in what you've just said that interested me was that this point about video games. I think it is relevant in the sense that these things, they do obviously program subjects, and obviously your example, this literature, the idea that this literature causes violence or video games cause violence is a sort of quite superficial or kind of barbaric way of asking the question. But what it does do is plug into us through drives and impulses, and these media, whether it's film, literature, games, whatever you might choose, they do have a ability to produce enjoyment and enjoy through us, and that puts the subject in an interesting position in relation to the so-called text, which is worth exploring psychoanalytically, which is a very different approach, I think.
Yeah, and it's also like, aside from to go back to the topic of something or the the genre of the seduction novel, it's also like, why do we enjoy reading all these novels? Always end in tragedy, and it can't just be because we're trying to you're trying to teach impressionable young women not to listen to the sweet nothings whispered in their ear by rakes, but why is the reader compelled to keep enjoying reading and the plots themselves? It's like repetition compulsion. I
don't think moral ideology is what pulls people into that.
Definitely not.
Right?
Definitely not. Right.
It's the jouissance, isn't it?
Yeah. It is. And that's why a lot of these books ended up being, well, not so much the early ones, but when seduction narratives start to show up or resurface in like Melville, like later in the 19th century, it's like, no, we need to, people reject it sort of out of hand. And I think it's a disavowal in a way.
Yeah. I mean, no, absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, great. I agree with that. And it's slightly back to the old topic now, but the characters are also important in your writing. And this is the thing I was also thinking about. It's not, you do, in fact, give close readings of characters. And you were just talking about the lead character from The Coquette and how important that is. And in your Moby Dick, analysis, you talk about individual characters. And this quote here that I was just going to read out is precisely to do with this question, I suppose, of why are we moved in the ways we're moved, and how do we understand that at the level of subject, and so on. So I'm just going to read the quote from Melville, and then I'm going to get you to do kind of close reading of it. So here we go. What is it? What nameless, inscrutable, unearthly thing it is? What cozening, hidden lord and master, and cruel, remorseless emperor commands me? that against all natural lovings and longings, I so keep pushing and crowding and jamming myself on all the time, recklessly making me do what in my own proper natural heart I durst not so much as dare. Is Ahab Ahab? Is it I, God, or who, that lifts this arm? Now, I think it's a great quote for exactly what Eliot said as well about why do we push ourselves against ourselves in this direction, but also, this also broader question of what moves us when we move, right? What remorseless emperor commands me, and so on. So, maybe you pick this quote, but maybe you can speak to us about how you think it works and what do you think it embodies.
Yeah. So that quote, I'll contextualize it a little bit. So that quote comes, I forget if it's the first or second. No, actually, it might. I think it's this from the chapter "The Symphony," which is the chapter just before the 3-day chase of Moby Dick that concludes the novel, and everything is starting to fall apart already. And that is a speech that Ahab delivers. He's actually speaking to somebody. He's speaking to the first mate Starbuck, but he kind of. Starbuck very quickly sort of disappears and it becomes a monologue because Starbuck is saying, we can go back. We don't have to, chase this monstrous whale. It's not chasing you. We're chasing it. And Ahab he's on the verge. He looks Starbuck in the eye and he's on the verge of sympathizing with him and saying, okay, let's return back. He even tells Starbuck, if I go out to lower for Moby Dick, you stay here so that you can, live to see your wife and your kids. But then all of a sudden, it's like drive takes over. But he very clearly articulates it, like this split self. Is Ahab Ahab? Who's moving? What causality, right? Why do we do what we do? What's pulling us? And the way that passage is often read, and there are a number of different passages throughout the novel where it's the question often gets posed as like this dialectic between free will and fate, right? So is Ahab merely, and I think it's shortly after that passage, he says something similar, like, I'm the fate's lieutenant. I'm following orders, basically. And those two are often thought of, fate and free will as, diametrically opposed. But what's interesting from the psychoanalytic perspective is that freedom almost always, you can't help but appear to the subject as a kind of fate, right? I know Zizek has talked about this. Mladen Dolar has talked about this. I think there's an old article or chapter of Mladen's titled "At First Sight," and it's about like, when you're hit by love or struck by Cupid's arrow. I think Zizek calls this unconscious choice in a way. Like, it's not so much that the subject chooses its object; it's that the object chooses the subject, and so the subject's freedom is like determining to maintain sort of fidelity to that object, or to that to what's driving you. And so what's really interesting, what's fascinating to me in those passages is that the characters, even though drive is unconscious, the way in which the literary form itself, or maybe it's more the dialogue here, but can call attention to this. The fact that these characters know full well that there's a split, and that even though Ahab is consciously pursuing the white whale, right? I mean, he announces to the entire crew after they're far enough away that they can't turn the ship around that this is what they've shipped for to follow his vengeance, basically. But he's nonetheless driven even beyond that, right? So at some point he recognizes that this runs against the good. And of course, like the ethics of psychoanalysis is that, jouissance has nothing to do with good, right? I mean, Lacan says this in Seminar 7, like jouissance and the good couldn't be further apart, because jouissance is, he says at one point, like jouissance is evil. And you get into this sort of question of like the moral good and diabolical evil being kind of formally indistinguishable. Alenka Zupančič talks about this a lot. But those kind of passages, there are similar passages in Poe where the characters say, one of his stories, The Black Cat, he describes this phenomenon, and in a few other tales he does, titled, or he calls it perverseness. And it's not perversion in the psychoanalytic sense, but he says doing something not for any good or aim, but actually because we know that it'll undermine yourself or undermine the self. So he hangs his favored cat. He says because he knows that he was jeopardizing his eternal soul in doing that, and he's aware of this split, of this compulsion beyond his conscious self, but they just get carried away by the drive. And so passages like that, where the characters so clearly articulate this split between like ego, I, and this excessive form of being or para-being that is, that psychoanalysis designates as subjectivity. That's what really fascinates me. And I think that passages like the one you just read, where Ahab is asking, what is moving me? What am I moving myself? Or
this is the philosophical question that keeps coming up. Which the very basic one is, what's the cause? Like drive, good, excess.
Yeah, and in a way, like the subject causes itself, right? Which is sort of irony. I mean, the object kind of, there's a dialectical relationship there, right? Where the subject is object. Or is sort of objet. Like that's the only materialization we have of subject, which is why I think it's different from the viewer. I had a debate with Graham Harman about this, where he was talking about Lacan's it's the Seminar 11, the sardine can, right? And he wants to argue that Lacan's point that it's not that I am in the picture. It's not just that the picture looks at me. Hopefully I'm not going, too far afield here, but
no, please. I think this is the place.
Okay. So his argument is basically like, this is kind of Lacan's point is basically the same as Merleau-Ponty's point, where the world looks back at us. And my claim was like, that's not what Lacan is saying at all. I mean, if you take the ambassadors as, his example, it's not that like subject would not in that instance be, at least as I understand it, the phenomenological viewer of the painting. Like that's the person. And I think that the anamorphic skull that's looking back at us, like that's subjectivity. So it's not that subject and object exist in this dyad. It's that, right, objet this anamorphic object born of desire, of looking awry, is actually the inscription of subject. So there's actually two entities, but basically the point that I'd want to make there is that that's the split, right? Like, so subject is what's in this sort of inhuman excess of humanity that renders humanity. I cite this is a Zizek line, but it's from Lacan, really, that this is what renders, human being sort of, an animal sick unto death, right? Is the sort of emergence of this traumatic kernel of subjectivity that's grounded in an enjoyment that, works against the person's or the human's self-interest, or good commonly understood. So and I'm glad you mentioned Eliot. It's also clearly a philosophical question. And so I came to psychoanalysis a little bit late. I was but I was interested early on in literature and philosophy. But I think bringing psychoanalysis into it, and in my work, psychoanalysis, I mean, I have all the respect in the world for the clinic, but I'm not, that's not what I'm working. I'm working in psychoanalytic theory, and I think that psychoanalysis is so important to helping to, if not necessarily like answer in some definitive sense, but to help approach some of these questions in a different way that brings us outside of, the question, like, is it the subject or is it the object? I think it's an extimate cause.
Yeah. Well, I mean, coming from the other direction, this is like exactly why I wanted to engage with Zizek in clinical practice, because you have these kind of basic ideas of like thoughts, feelings, behaviors, positivity of you will do mindfulness and you will not feel kind of distressed. You will reframe your idea in the positive, but like human subjectivity is just far more, has just a lot more to it. And
it's really extimacy, what you're talking about there, the part of the subject that's in the object and the part of the object that's in the subject. That's the sardine can thing.
That's like a very Hegelian kind of idea. I mean, this is like, I always think of this when you think of like the subject overcoming itself somehow and destroying itself, right? This is the Hegelian,
right?
This is like the sublation TM.
Yeah, I mean, but this is why, and now I don't want to get too far afield, but this is why I think like I'm really interested in dialectics, and I think extimacy is important there, because the way that similar to what I was saying earlier, where Lacan was taught almost exclusively as a philosopher of language, in at least within the confines of literature departments early on in the 70s, when a lot of French theory first erupted on the Anglo-American scene. Similarly, like Hegel is almost always taught by like this thesis, antithesis, synthesis model. But I think the antithesis, it's not that it's similar to subject. It's not that these are two. It's not that it's a dyadic relation, that you have two mutually exclusive entities that then engage in some sort of mediation. It's that antithesis is immanent, is inherent to the thesis itself. So it is a sort of, maybe it's a Hegelianized reading of but
also the cause, like, yeah, sure. Once again, it's like the antithesis of the immediate is its kind of cause, and also it's overcoming itself, and this there's all sorts of traumatic kind of gaps which are cause the thing to sublate, right?
No, and I guess that's Mladen's kind of contribution to the studies of Hegel, this kind of originary dialectics that's there from the start, rather than the pre-existing. I mean, as an aside, I don't know if you've probably got more to add, but as an aside, you mentioned Graham Harman, but I was also going to ask about that, because your last, I feel like you've got a bit more to say about that. I mean, your last, your conclusion of the piece you did in the book you did with Zizek is a kind of, a critique of objects, a kind of very short critique of object-oriented ontology. So I think it'd be good if you could just unpack that. Yeah, what was at the heart of that discussion with or the debate with Harman, and why did you write this kind of? Why do you think it's important to offer this critique of OOO via psychoanalysis, I guess?
Yeah. So coming at it from Melville studies, really, there is a lot of energy. It's a little bit less these days, but I'd say 5 or 6 years ago, a book like Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter has been out for over a decade now, but around the middle of the last decade, somewhere around 2014, 15, new materialism and object-oriented ontology, that's when, at least from within my field of literature, that's when literature professors or scholars started to get interested in that kind of thing. And Melville is almost always Melville is kind of like the poster child for those kind of approaches. I have a piece in a book that was just published recently called Ahab Unbound, and it's Melville. The subtitle is Melville and the Materialist Turn, and it's a great book. But most of the approaches are, or let me put it this way: there's far more sort of new materialist, object-oriented ontology, sort of like Deleuzian approaches to Melville, and with good reason, because Deleuze and both separately and with Guattari often talked about Moby Dick and becoming whale, and as an example of they cite the whale as an example of body without organs, and my take has always been the Zizekian organs without bodies, where I'm more interested in the function of something like lamella than and lack, as opposed to surplus or deterritorialization. But so to come back to the question, that's where I kind of encountered it first, was like, I'm not sure that this is necessarily getting, not that there's a right answer, but I'm pretty sure there was a lot of material, like Melville was trying to move beyond subjectivity, right? And my argument would be that that's not the case, that Melville is obsessed with the phenomenon of subjectivity. He's interested in objects, but there's no object for him, divorced from the subject. I would argue.
Yeah. Well, it's not fully disconnected from thought.
Yeah.
This is the Hegelian idealist point, which is how do you get the object without you're thinking about the object, right?
Right. So exactly. So that's what got me sort of interested. I read more, Harman and Levi Bryant, and the more I read, even though Bryant is Lacanian in certain regards, the more I thought that that it's just the opposite of, or not necessarily the opposite, but it's incommensurable with a Lacanian materialist approach. And so what happened with Harman was Slavoj and I did that book you mentioned, Subject Lessons, and Harman wrote a pretty, like, a generous, it wasn't so much a review, but an essay sort of critiquing our critique of object-oriented ontology and new materialism. And so I have a piece that responds to Harman's response in Open Philosophy, but where I talk about this sort of phenomena, where this misreading of Lacan and the sardine can scene. But I do think that what interested me in it, also some of Alenka's engagement with object-oriented ontology in her book What is Sex, where she says, if there is a Lacanian ontology, it can only be an object disoriented ontology, right? An ontology disoriented by object A, objet A. And so that's what interested me in it, because of course if you work in psychoanalytic theory, you're interested in objects and the object, but the object without a subject, or a subjectless object. Or Bryant also makes a case that objects are split in the same way that, or much the same way that a subject is split. I just think that's, I disagree with that from a Lacanian perspective. So that's how I got into sort of that field. And so there is a little sort of critique of new materialism and object-oriented ontology at the end of that Melville piece that you were quoting from. But it's sort of extended beyond in that piece. But I just don't think you can flatten ontology, because I think the subject is what would prevent any sort of flat ontology. Why
do people want to flatten ontology? So this is like a vaguely provocative / stupid question. Why do you think this generation of academics now? But does seem to be like a movement towards flattening subjectivity itself.
I mean, I think
what's with that? Is it just like a continuation of materialism and Marx, or is it something else entirely? Like, what is this?
I think that, I mean, the way that I most make sense of it is that, and this isn't true for everyone, but there's an ecological dimension to it, where this is how Jane Bennett will pose it, and I think Levi Bryant in certain respects, right? That or even Harman says, it doesn't make sense or it's not correct to say that humans take up 50% of ontology, and then everything else is on the same ontological plane. But Bennett says at one point that theories of subjectivity actually aid in our in humanity's continued accelerated destruction of the globe and of the climate. So it's often pitched as a sort of moral, ethical, sort of ecological take. Not always. Sort of step back from human hubris and because we're destroying the earth. And my point would be, I agree with that, but that's not, I think there's a conflation of humanity and subjectivity there, or person and subject, and those two are not the same thing. If they were, we wouldn't have so much trouble.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It seems to me politically dangerous to unplug the subject from the environment in this way. Like, to have a situation where you can imagine a world without the human, without subjectivity, objects living without the subject. That seems to be an unplugging of the subject and its just drives and desires from the system which it's built and which it lives in, and that would depoliticize the subject too far. I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah.
Not to mention animal subjectivity. Not to go down that road. Bees. The bees debate.
Great to discuss this. I mean, I could go on talking about this definitely, but I also just wanted, before we run out of time, to talk about to just ask you a much more general question about the teaching and students and literature. We started by talking about literature departments, and you said that you felt that, to a certain extent, certainly in psychoanalysis, but maybe also you maybe feel similarly. I don't know. I feel similarly about Marxism and other theoretical approaches that I consider politically useful. They've lost some of their connection with those departments and so on. But I'd be interested to hear from you about whether you think that literature still remains a critical way of engaging students with psychoanalytic Marxist ideas and approaches, and whether you actually do see that there's still a kind of lifeblood in that happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I teach, so when I don't do, let me put it this way. In most of my undergraduate classes, that's when I sort of will be guilty of using psychoanalysis as a kind of supplement. So I'll teach a handful of Poe's, poems or tales, and then we'll look at maybe, while we're in class, I don't know, a page or two, or maybe a paragraph or two from something like Beyond the Pleasure Principle, or something from, one of, I don't think I've ever brought anything from Écrit into my undergrad class, but maybe something more digestible from the seminars. And I do think that, that there is an excitement there, or an energy there. The students do want to think with literature theoretically, or sometimes it's more theoretical, sometimes it's more philosophical, and then in my grad theory classes is where I'm like, okay, read Hamlet, and we're reading half of Seminar 6 or something like that, right? But I do think that I think it's best when they're paired together. That's when I've had the best success. Some of Lacan's seminars and Freud are accessible, especially for grad students. But I think when I pair it with examples like from Poe or from Melville, even like Hawthorne, other authors, I think that this is why somebody like Zizek is so. I think the appeal is so great, because I think it teaches very well. I can't tell you how many times I've used a clip from that scene from Pervert's Guide to Cinema, where he takes the Bates house, and ground floor is ego. The upstairs with the mother, that's super ego. The basement is id. So I teach film sometimes too. I think when you can actually have these literary filmic examples, again, where it's not as simple as saying, okay, this translates to ego, this translates to id, this translates it's hard to think of a better example of a superego, voice, or a maternal superego than Norman Bates's mother. So it's not that we need to bring the psychoanalysis into this. It's that it's sort of already there. It's like psychoanalysis can help to sort of deploy, or can help us deploy the sort of theoretical, philosophical sort of strain of the literary or the filmic itself. So that's how I try to, teach it. Or like, for instance, you mentioned Marx, right? So I teach a class pretty frequently, social novel in America. And it's like, okay, before instead of just giving you, the Communist Manifesto or portions from German ideology, which I do, I'm like, okay, let's read part of, I don't know. The Jungle is pretty a straightforward, simplistic. That one's pretty easy. We don't need much decoding, but
don't eat the hot dog.
Don't eat. Yeah. Let's move beyond exactly. Like, okay, we all know we're not going to eat the hot dog after reading this, but let's go to the politics of it, right? So I just find that literature, again, it's another example where it's already sort of doing the work, and so you can get pushback from people who think, or want to read literature or treat literature with a capital L as this sort of like autonomous field in and of itself. But I've always approached it kind of interdisciplinarily, intertextually. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I kind of, try to approach when I'm different ways of approaching it in the classroom.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, no, I'm just interested. I mean, I'm just interested in how people do those things. I mean, I did have a really inspirational literature teacher myself who we interviewed some weeks ago, Jeremy Tambling, who basically, did comparable stuff to what you've described. And it's just good to know that. And for me, that totally, me being in his class totally changed everything for me. So it's interesting to hear that this is still going on in literature departments and that, you're carrying the talk to this stuff in this effective way. It's great.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you where you get the most pushback from first year, like freshman students. Like if I'm teaching, English 102, where like introduction to literature, and they have to read. So they read poetry, drama, and fiction. And if you do Hamlet, and if you I give them like 2 pages from, Interpretation of Dreams, where he talks about, the Oedipus complex and Hamlet. And because it's a literature class, but you're not necessarily in a literature classroom there. You have a lot of, science majors and stuff. And they just totally, Oedipus complex, they just totally, because they're taking it so literally that it's like, it's a pulling teeth to try to get them to go along with that.
No, it's so interesting that, because it just makes me think of myself as a first year student. Like in my first, I'll stop talking in a minute, but in my first week at university, I got a lecture by Terry Eagleton, who I massively admire now. And it was about a Marxist reading of Bar Bar Black Sheep. And I remember coming out and saying to my friends, what a pile of shit that is, just absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
And it was years before I realized actually it was one of the most interesting lectures I'd ever heard, but there is something
that was my first response to Zizek. Sorry,
go on, Elliot. Sorry.
That was my first response when I was exposed to Zizek. My first kind of reaction, I don't even remember what it was, but I'd never heard of him in undergraduate, and I just said, what is this shit? Like the very first, I read it, going to Santa Cruz, very radical liberal. And then you're exposed to Zizek, it's just of something else. It's of a different cloth, really.
Yeah. No, but I guess the whole education system is structured and stacked against you being able to do these things. So it takes some kind of reversal to actually get it going. But it's been great. We've covered so much. It's been really lovely to have you on, Russell, and talk about everything.
It's been great. I really enjoyed it.
It's really interesting stuff. And
in the straightforward sense of enjoy, not the psychoanalytic.
Why I think it's not shit. It subverts kind of dominant notions and stories that we tell ourselves of Melville and the white whale is kind of, see it as a kind of basic reading of a madman kind of on a pursuit, but there's within it this kind of method of traumatic enjoyment, right? There's this kind of deeper, not to be depth psychology, but you could almost say a deeper kind of thing in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had Slavoj was at the university a few weeks ago, and I was, having said that, I generally don't do a lot of psychoanalysis, or at least extended psychoanalytic theory in a lot of my undergrad classes, but it was so heartening to see after how many students came to the talk. There were the students were more than probably 2/3 of the audience, and then afterwards, this will happen most places. He goes, but afterwards, it was all the students who wanted to talk to him for an hour after. And so I was like, okay, that's a good, maybe, psychoanalysis, even though it's probably looked upon, I would guess most colleagues across the university would be sort of, is this phrenology or something, a sort of pseudoscience. I think that there's clearly still an energy and an interest among students when they get exposed to it. It's just that there are a few people exposing them to it. So
yeah, well, I think the super ego kind of logic of neoliberal capital, I don't think is enough for people, and people are getting drawn more and more to psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
So just quickly then, Russell, what can people look out for from you in the coming time?
So it's going to be, it'll be a while until the Melville book, Melville and Lacan, that you were so kind to mention, will be out. But I have there's a few sort of, teaser pieces. There's one in that Subject Lessons book. There's another in that Ahab Unbound collection I was talking about. The next thing that's probably going to come out is the piece that I was talking about earlier on Poe and the Raven, which is going to be titled Ravenous Sex, and it's going to be in the journal because it's on Death Drive, and sexuation, right? So that's going to be in the journal Cultural Critique, but not for a while yet. So it'll be a ways, but it'll be out eventually.
Great. No, it's great. It's been great to have you on. So thanks again for joining us, and lovely to talk about all this stuff. And have a good weekend. And so
it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Cheers, Russell. And thanks everyone for listening. See you all next week. Bye, everyone.